In the harsh mountains of West Virginia, where coal dust settled like snow and hope was as scarce as honest work, a 17-year-old girl named Sarah Coleman was about to discover that sometimes the cruelest betrayals come from those who are supposed to love us most. What her drunken father did to her on that cold February morning in 1954 would shock even the hardened miners, who thought they'd seen every kind of human cruelty. But what happened next would prove that sometimes angels come in the most unexpected forms, and that true worth has nothing to do with what the world sees as broken. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the hills around Blackwater Hollow like a shroud, hiding the scars that decades of coal mining had carved into the once beautiful landscape. In a ramshackle cabin perched precariously on the hillside, 17-year-old Sarah Coleman stirred a pot of thin gruel over a wood-burning stove, her movements careful and deliberate despite the makeshift wooden crutch propped against the counter within arm's reach. Sarah had been born with a twisted left leg, a condition that in the isolated mountain community of 1954 was seen as either God's punishment or the devil's mark, depending on who was talking. Her leg was noticeably shorter than her right, and walking required the aid of the crude crutch her late mother had fashioned from an old oak branch when Sarah was 7 years old. But what truly set Sarah apart wasn't her physical disability, it was the fierce intelligence that burned in her green eyes and the gentle strength that had kept her family from complete ruin for the past 3 years. Margaret Coleman had died when Sarah was 14, succumbing to the lung disease that claimed so many women in the hollow, worn down by years of breathing coal dust and caring for families with little hope of escaping poverty. On her deathbed, Margaret had gripped Sarah's hand with surprising strength and whispered, "Promise me you'll never let them convince you that you're worth less because of your leg. Promise me you'll remember that God doesn't make mistakes, only people do." Sarah had promised, though keeping that promise had become increasingly difficult as her father, Thomas Coleman, descended deeper into the bottle that had become his constant companion since his wife's death. Thomas had once been a proud miner, bringing home steady wages and speaking of moving the family to Charleston, where Sarah could get proper medical care for her leg. But a cave-in that had killed 2 of his friends and injured a dozen others had shattered something fundamental in Thomas's spirit, leaving him unable to go underground again and unwilling to find alternative work. The Coleman cabin, which had once echoed with Margaret's laughter and the warm conversations of a loving family, now reeked of moonshine and unfulfilled promises. Thomas spent his days drinking away what little money came from Sarah's small jobs, mending clothes for neighbors, tending their vegetable gardens, and occasionally helping with reading and writing for the many adults in the hollow who had never learned such skills. Sarah's younger brother, Daniel, had died of pneumonia the previous winter, and his death had pushed Thomas completely over the edge of despair. The boy had been Thomas's hope for the future, the son who would grow strong and escape the mountains to make something of himself. With Daniel gone, Thomas seemed to view Sarah not as his remaining child to cherish and protect, but as a burden that reminded him daily of his failures as a provider and protector. The morning that would change everything began like countless others, with Sarah preparing breakfast from whatever meager supplies remained in their near-empty pantry. She had managed to trade some mended shirts for a few eggs and a small piece of salt pork, luxuries that would have to last them several days. As she cooked, she mentally calculated their remaining resources and wondered how long she could stretch them before they faced actual starvation. Thomas stumbled into the kitchen area, his clothes wrinkled from sleeping in them, his gray hair matted and his eyes bloodshot from another night of drinking. At 45, he looked like a man of 60, aged by grief, alcohol, and the crushing weight of poverty that had defeated his every attempt to climb out of it. "Morning, Gaddy," Sarah said quietly, not turning from the stove. She had learned that direct eye contact in the morning often triggered his anger, reminding him of how much she resembled her mother. Thomas grunted in response, slumping into one of the two remaining chairs at their scarred wooden table. The other chairs had been sold months ago, along with most of their possessions, to buy liquor and the minimal food that kept them alive. "Got any coffee?" he asked, his voice rough from years of cigarettes and moonshine. "No, sir. We finished the last of it yesterday. I made some chicory tea, though. It's almost as good." Sarah's voice carried the practiced cheerfulness of someone who had learned to find silver linings in every disappointment. Thomas's face darkened at this reminder of their poverty. "Chicory tea," he muttered. "Your mother never would have served me chicory tea. She knew how to keep a proper house, knew how to make a man feel like he was worth something when he came home." Sarah bit back the obvious response that her mother had never had to manage a household with no income while caring for a disabled daughter and an alcoholic husband. Margaret Coleman had been a saint, but even saints needed resources to work miracles. "I've been thinking about going down to Murphy's store today," Sarah said carefully, ladling the thin gruel into 2 bowls. "Mrs. Murphy mentioned she might have some sewing work for me. Could be enough to buy some real coffee and maybe some bacon." Thomas looked up sharply, his expression shifting from self-pity to something that made Sarah's stomach clench with unease. "Murphy's store, huh? That's a long walk for someone with your ... condition." The way he said "condition" made it sound like a personal failing rather than a birth defect, and Sarah felt the familiar sting of shame that she'd been fighting her entire life. "I manage fine, Daddy. I've been making that walk twice a week for months now." "Yeah, I've noticed how you manage," Thomas said, his voice taking on a cruel edge that had become more common in recent months. "Hobbling around on that stick, making people uncomfortable, making them pity us. You think I don't see how they look at us? How they whisper about poor Thomas Coleman and his crippled daughter." Sarah's hands trembled as she set his bowl in front of him, careful not to let the hurt show on her face. She had heard the whispers too, but they weren't always cruel. Many people in the Hollow respected her determination and kindness, and several families had specifically requested her help with various tasks because they trusted her skill and gentle nature. "People don't think about my leg once they get to know me," Sarah said quietly. "Mrs. Henderson said I'm the best seamstress she's ever seen. And Mr. Williams told Preacher Davis that I helped his grandson learn to read better than any teacher they've had. Yeah, well, being good at women's work and teaching children doesn't put money in our pockets, does it?" Thomas picked up his spoon but didn't eat, instead staring into the gray mixture as if it held answers to questions he was afraid to ask. "You know what does put money in pockets? Having something valuable to trade." Something in his tone made Sarah's blood run cold. She had heard this particular inflection before, usually when he was contemplating selling something else from their dwindling possessions. But they had nothing left to sell except the clothes on their backs and the furniture they needed to survive. "Daddy, what are you thinking about?" she asked, settling carefully into her chair and reaching for her own spoon. Thomas finally looked directly at her, and what Sarah saw in his eyes made her forget about breakfast entirely. There was a calculating coldness there, mixed with desperation, and something that looked almost like hatred. "I've been talking to some men," he said slowly. "Men who have opportunities for young women who are willing to work hard and aren't too proud to do what needs doing." Sarah felt her world tilt sideways. "What kind of opportunities?" "The kind that pay cash money up front," Thomas replied, his voice growing stronger as he convinced himself that what he was considering was reasonable. "There's a fellow named Jake Morrison who runs a establishment over in Beckley. He's always looking for girls who can cook and clean and take care of men who work hard for their money." The euphemism was thin enough that Sarah could see through it immediately, and horror began to creep up her spine like ice water. "Daddy, no. You can't be thinking what I think you're thinking." "I'm thinking about survival," Thomas snapped, his voice rising with defensive anger. "I'm thinking about the fact that we're going to starve to death in this godforsaken cabin if something doesn't change soon. I'm thinking about the fact that you're 17 years old and you've never brought a man around, never shown any sign of getting married and becoming someone else's responsibility. Because no decent man would want a cripple," Sarah finished. Quietly, the words hitting her like physical blows, even though she'd thought them herself countless times. "That's not what I meant," Thomas said, but his tone suggested it was exactly what he meant. "I'm saying that maybe it's time you started contributing something more than pocket change from your little sewing projects. Morrison says he'd pay good money for a girl who knows how to work and won't cause trouble. Says he has customers who prefer quieter types." Sarah pushed back from the table, her crutch clattering as she struggled to stand. "Daddy, please tell me you haven't already made some kind of deal with this man." Thomas's silence was answer. Enough, and Sarah felt her legs, both the good one and the damaged one, begin to shake. "How much?" she whispered. $2, Thomas said, not meeting her eyes. "Plus he'll make sure you get fed regular and have a roof over your head. That's more than I can promise you here." $2. Her father was willing to sell her into what was essentially slavery for $2. Sarah sank back into her chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of his betrayal. She had known that Thomas resented her disability and the burden it represented, but she had never imagined that his desperation would lead him to this. "Mama made you promise to take care of me," Sarah said, her voice barely audible. "When she was dying, she made you promise." "Your mama is dead," Thomas replied harshly. "Dead people don't keep you warm at night or put food on the table. I've got to deal with the living world, and in the living world, everything has a price." Sarah closed her eyes, trying to process the reality of her situation. She was trapped in an isolated mountain cabin with a man who saw her as a commodity to be sold rather than a daughter to be protected. She had no money, no relatives who might help her, and no way to travel far enough to escape whatever arrangement Thomas had made. "When?" she asked finally. "Morrison's coming this afternoon. He wants to meet you first. Make sure you're suitable for his establishment." The word "suitable" made Sarah's skin crawl. She could imagine what criteria Jake Morrison would use to evaluate her worth, and she was certain that her disability would either disqualify her entirely or make her available only for the most desperate and degraded customers. "And if I refuse to go with him?" Thomas's expression hardened further. "Then you can find somewhere else to live, because I can't afford to keep feeding you if you won't help support yourself. Winter's coming again, and I won't starve for the sake of someone who's too proud to do her part." The threat was clear, and Sarah understood that her choices had been reduced to prostitution or homelessness. In the mountains of West Virginia, in 1954, a disabled teenage girl had virtually no chance of survival on her own. Thomas knew this, and he was using it to force her compliance with his horrific plan. Sarah spent the morning in a state of numb shock, mechanically completing her usual chores while her mind raced through impossible escape scenarios. She could try to walk to the nearest town, but it was more than 20 miles away, and the mountain roads were treacherous, even for someone with 2 good legs. She could hide in the woods, but winter was approaching, and she would freeze to death within. Dazed out by noon, she had accepted the terrible reality that she had no good options. Jake Morrison would arrive that afternoon, and she would either submit to his evaluation and be taken away to a life of degradation, or she would be thrown out to die slowly of exposure and starvation. As she sat by the window, watching for the stranger who would seal her fate, Sarah thought about her mother's final words about God not making mistakes. If that was true, then perhaps there was some purpose to the suffering she was about to endure. Perhaps her disability, which had made her vulnerable to her father's betrayal, would also provide some protection in the hell she was about to enter. The sound of an automobile engine struggling up the mountain road interrupted her dark thoughts. Through the grimy window, she could see a black car approaching their cabin, and she knew that her childhood, what little of it had been happy, was officially over. Jake Morrison stepped out of the car, and Sarah's first glimpse of him confirmed her worst fears about what kind of man would pay for the right to control a desperate teenage girl. He was tall and thin, with the pale complexion of someone who spent most of his time indoors, and his clothes were expensive enough to mark him as someone with money, but cheap enough to suggest questionable sources of income. Sarah watched him approach the cabin with Thomas hurrying behind him like an eager dog, and she felt something inside her chest go cold and hard. If she was going to survive whatever came next, she would need to find strength she didn't know she possessed. She would need to remember that her worth as a human being had nothing to do with what others saw when they looked at her broken body. As Morrison's footsteps approached the cabin door, Sarah straightened her shoulders and prepared to meet the man who thought he could buy her for $2. She might not be able to prevent what was about to happen, but she could control how she faced it. And she was determined to face it with the dignity her mother had tried to teach her, no matter what price her father had placed on her head. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Jake Morrison entered the Coleman cabin like a man surveying livestock at market, his calculating eyes taking inventory of everything from the sparse furnishings to Sarah herself. He moved with the predatory confidence of someone accustomed to exploiting desperate people, and his expensive cologne couldn't quite mask the underlying scent of corruption that seemed to follow him like a shadow. "So this is the girl," Morrison said, circling Sarah as she stood frozen beside the kitchen table. His voice carried the smooth tones of someone who had perfected the art of making terrible propositions sound reasonable. "Turn around, honey. Let me get a proper look at what we're dealing with here." Sarah's cheeks burned with humiliation, but she forced herself to remain still. She would not give this man the satisfaction of seeing her break down before he'd even finished his evaluation. Thomas hovered nervously in the corner, wringing his hands like a man who knew he was committing an unforgivable sin, but lacked the strength to stop himself. "The leg," Morrison observed, his tone clinical as he noted her crutch and the obvious difference in her stance. "How bad is it? Can she work on her feet for long periods?" "She manages fine around here," Thomas said quickly, his voice carrying the desperate enthusiasm of a salesman trying to close a deal. "Cooks, cleans, does all the household tasks. Never complains about it neither." Morrison's laugh was cold and calculating. "Thomas, my friend, household tasks and the kind of work I have in mind are two very different things. But I'll grant you that she's got a certain vulnerability that some of my clientele find appealing. Men who've been underground all week sometimes prefer their company a little less threatening, if you catch my meaning." The implication made Sarah's stomach lurch, but she kept her expression carefully neutral. She had learned long ago that showing fear or revulsion only encouraged cruel people to push harder. "What's your name, girl?" Morrison asked, finally addressing her directly. "Sarah Coleman," she replied, her voice steady despite the terror coursing through her veins. "Well, Sarah Coleman, your daddy here tells me you're in need of employment. Says you're willing to work hard and follow instructions without causing trouble. Is that accurate?" Sarah glanced at Thomas, who was avoiding her eyes entirely, staring at the floor like a man who couldn't bear to witness his own actions. The coward couldn't even look at her while he sold her into hell. "I've always worked hard," Sarah said carefully. "But I think there might be some misunderstanding about what kind of work you're offering." Morrison's smile revealed teeth that were too white and too sharp. "No misunderstanding at all, sweetheart. I run an establishment in Beckley that caters to hard-working men who deserve some comfort and companionship after long weeks in the mines. My girls provide that comfort in exchange for room, board, and protection from the harsh realities of mountain life. The euphemisms were so transparent they bordered on insulting, but Sarah recognized that Morrison was giving her a chance to pretend ignorance if she chose to take it. Many girls in her position probably grasped at such face-saving illusions, telling themselves they were simply accepting employment as maids or companions rather than acknowledging the true nature of their circumstances. "And if I don't feel suited for that kind of companionship?" Sarah asked. Morrison's expression shifted subtly, revealing a glimpse of the steel beneath his smooth exterior. "Well, now, that would be disappointing for everyone involved. Your daddy here has already accepted my down payment, and I've made special arrangements to accommodate someone with your particular limitations. It would be a shame to waste such preparation." Thomas flinched at the word limitations, finally, looking up with guilt-ridden eyes. "Sarah, honey, you got to understand. We ain't got no other choice here. Morrison's offering you a roof over your head and regular meals. That's more than I can provide." "For $2, Sarah said quietly, her voice cutting through the cabin's stifling atmosphere like a blade. "You sold me for $2. The amount hung in the air between them, highlighting the absolute worthlessness Thomas placed on his daughter's life and dignity. Morrison seemed amused by the exchange, clearly enjoying the family drama unfolding before him. $2 is just the down payment," Morrison clarified with false generosity. "There'll be more money coming to your daddy once you're settled and proving your worth. Think of it as an investment in your future." Sarah wanted to laugh at the absurdity of describing prostitution as an investment in her future, but she was afraid that if she started laughing, she might never stop. Instead, she focused on Morrison's words about accommodating someone with her limitations. The phrase suggested he had specific plans for how to exploit her disability, and she dreaded discovering what those plans entailed. "When would I need to leave?" she asked, resigned to the inevitable. "Right now," Morrison replied. "I've got business in Charleston tomorrow, and I'd like to get you settled before I head out. No point in drawing this out unnecessarily." Sarah looked around the cabin that had been her home for 17 years, taking in the patches her mother had sewn on the curtains, the marks on the doorframe where Daniel's height had been measured. Each birthday, the rocking chair where Margaret Coleman had spent her final weeks coughing her life away. Everything that represented love and family would be left behind, while the man who should have protected her counted his $2 with shaking hands. "Can I pack some things?" she asked. "Just the basics," Morrison said. "I'll provide everything you need once we get to Beckley. My girls dress appropriately for their work, and I suspect your current wardrobe isn't quite suitable for our clientele." The casual dismissal of her few possessions felt like another small death. The dress she wore had been sewn by her mother's hands, and her other clothes carried memories of happier times when the Coleman family had hope for the future. But Morrison was probably right that her homemade mountain clothes would be inappropriate for whatever role he intended her to play. Sarah moved carefully to the corner where her belongings were stored in a battered trunk that had belonged to her grandmother. She selected her mother's Bible, a photograph of her family taken before Daniel's death, and a small wooden carving her brother had made for her birthday. Everything else, the clothes Margaret had sewn with such care, the books Sarah had saved money to buy, the small treasures that marked the milestones of her short life, would remain behind like artifacts of a person who had ceased to exist. Morrison watched her pack with visible impatience, clearly eager to complete his transaction and move on to other business. "That's enough sentiment," he said, as Sarah hesitated over a quilt her mother had made. "You're starting a new life now, and dwelling on the past won't do you any good." Thomas finally found his voice as Sarah closed her small bag. "Maybe I should come with you. Make sure she gets settled proper." "That won't be necessary," Morrison cut him off with cold finality. "Sarah's a big girl now, and she needs to learn to depend on herself rather than Daddy. Besides, you've got that $2 to celebrate with." The dismissal was brutal in its casualness, reducing years of family bonds to a simple financial transaction. Thomas wilted under Morrison's contempt, finally understanding perhaps that he had sold not just his daughter, but his own soul. As they prepared to leave, Sarah took one last look at her father, searching his face for any sign of regret or second thoughts. What she saw instead was relief mixed with shame, the expression of a man who had chosen the easy path over the right one and was already working to justify his decision. "Goodbye, Daddy," she said quietly, and the words carried the weight of final farewell rather than temporary parting. Thomas opened his mouth as if to say something, then closed it again without speaking. There were no words that could bridge the chasm his betrayal had created between them, and they both knew it. Morrison's automobile was larger and more expensive than any vehicle Sarah had ever been inside, with leather seats and chrome fixtures that spoke of wealth acquired through questionable means. As Morrison started the engine, Sarah pressed her face to the window for one final glimpse of the cabin where she had experienced both the greatest happiness and deepest sorrow of her life. Thomas stood in the doorway, a small figure growing smaller as they descended the mountain road. He raised his hand in a hesitant wave, but Sarah didn't wave back. As far as she was concerned, her father had died the moment he accepted Morrison's money. The drive to Beckley took 3 hours through winding mountain roads that Sarah had never traveled before. Morrison attempted conversation at first, asking questions about her education, her experience with men, and her understanding of what would be expected of her. When Sarah's responses remained monosyllabic, he eventually gave up and focused on driving while humming tunelessly under his breath. Sarah spent the journey staring out at the passing landscape, watching the familiar mountains of her childhood give way to unfamiliar territory. Each mile carried her further from everything she had known and closer to a future that terrified her more than anything she had ever imagined. As afternoon faded into evening, the lights of Beckley began to appear in the distance. The town was larger than any place Sarah had ever seen, with electric streetlights and paved roads that seemed impossibly sophisticated compared to the dirt paths of Blackwater Hollow. Under different circumstances, she might have been excited to explore such a place. Instead, she felt only dread as Morrison navigated through streets that grew progressively seedier until they reached a district where harsh neon signs advertised establishments that operated outside the bounds of respectable society. Morrison's establishment occupied a 3-story building wedged between a liquor store and a pawn shop. The sign above the entrance read, "The Blue Moon Hotel," in faded blue letters, but the nature of the business conducted inside was obvious from the heavily made-up women visible through the front windows and the type of men who loitered on the sidewalk outside. "Home sweet home," Morrison said, with satisfaction as he parked behind the building. "Welcome to your new life, Sarah Coleman." As they approached the back entrance, Sarah caught glimpses through lit windows of women in various states of undress, some with customers, others simply waiting. The sight made her stomach clench with terror, but she forced herself to keep walking. She had survived 17 years of poverty, disability, and family tragedy. She would find a way to survive this too. Morrison led her through a narrow hallway that reeked of cheap perfume, stale cigarettes, and something else Sarah didn't want to identify. The walls were covered with peeling floral wallpaper that might have been cheerful once, but now looked garish under the harsh electric lighting. "Mrs. Henderson runs the day-to-day operations," Morrison explained as they climbed a creaking staircase. "She'll get you settled and explain the house rules. Most girls find the adjustment easier if they don't ask too many questions and focus on earning their keep." The warning was clear. Compliance would be rewarded, resistance would be punished. Sarah filed the information away along with everything else she was learning about her new prison. Mrs. Henderson turned out to be a woman in her 50s, with brassy blonde hair and eyes that had seen too much to retain any softness. She looked Sarah up and down with the same calculating expression Morrison had used, though her evaluation seemed more practical than predatory. "This is the new girl," Morrison announced. "Get her cleaned up and ready for work. I'll be back tomorrow to check on her progress." With that, he disappeared back down the staircase, leaving Sarah alone with a woman who would either become her protector or her worst enemy. "Well," Mrs. Henderson said with a sigh that suggested this conversation had been repeated countless times before. "Let's get you settled and figure out what we're working with here." As she followed Mrs. Henderson deeper into the Blue Moon Hotel, Sarah clutched her small bag of possessions and tried to remember her mother's words about God not making mistakes. If that was true, then perhaps there was some purpose to this nightmare, some reason why she had been brought to this place at this time. She would need to believe that, because without hope, she would never survive what came next. Mrs. Henderson's room on the second floor of the Blue Moon Hotel served as both office and personal quarters, decorated with an odd mixture of business ledgers and feminine touches that spoke of a woman trying to maintain dignity in an undignified profession. Faded photographs of what might have been family members lined the mantelpiece, while account books and bottles of various medications cluttered the desk near the window. "Sit down, honey," Mrs. Henderson said, gesturing to a worn velvet chair that had seen better decades. "Let's have ourselves a proper talk before we get you settled." Sarah lowered herself carefully into the chair, her crutch resting against her knee as she studied the woman who would apparently control her immediate future. Mrs. Henderson had the weathered appearance of someone who had survived by making hard choices, and there was a practical kindness in her manner that seemed genuine despite the circumstances. "First things first," Mrs. Henderson began, settling behind her desk with a cup of coffee that smelled far better than anything Sarah had tasted in months. "What did Morrison tell you about what goes on here?" "He said it was employment," Sarah replied carefully. "Providing comfort and companionship to working men." Mrs. Henderson's laugh was short and bitter. "Morrison's got a gift for pretty words, I'll give him that. Let me be clearer. This is a whorehouse, plain and simple. The men who come here pay for services that wives and sweethearts don't provide, or at least not often enough to satisfy them. Is that clear enough for you?" The blunt honesty was somehow less offensive than Morrison's euphemisms had been. Sarah appreciated that Mrs. Henderson was treating her as intelligent enough to handle the truth. "Yes, ma'am, that's clear." "Good. Now, given your situation," Mrs. Henderson's gaze flicked briefly to Sarah's crutch, "Morrison's got specific ideas about how you'll fit into our operations. Some men, particularly those who've had hard lives themselves, prefer girls who seem vulnerable or damaged. Makes them feel protective, or gives them someone they think won't judge their own shortcomings." Sarah felt her cheeks burn at being described as damaged, but she forced herself to listen without reacting. Understanding the dynamics at play might be crucial to her survival. "However," Mrs. Henderson continued, "I run a respectable establishment here, if such a thing can exist. My girls are clean, healthy, and treated with basic human dignity. You'll have your own room, regular meals, and medical care when needed. In return, you'll work hard, follow house rules, and give me no cause for complaint. What if I refuse?" Sarah asked quietly. Mrs. Henderson's expression softened slightly. "Honey, girls who refuse end up in places that make the Blue Moon look like a palace. Morrison owns you now, legally speaking, and he's got connections throughout the state. You can run, but you'll be found, and your next placement won't be nearly as comfortable as this one." The words were delivered with gentle finality, and Sarah understood that Mrs. Henderson was offering what protection she could within the constraints of an impossible situation. It wasn't freedom, but it might be survival. "I'll show you to your room," Mrs. Henderson said, rising from her desk. "Then we'll get you cleaned up and properly dressed. You'll start working tomorrow night." Sarah's room was on the third floor, Smaller than her childhood bedroom, but furnished with more luxury than she had ever experienced. The bed had an actual mattress rather than straw. The window had real glass and curtains, and there was even a small mirror and washstand with running water. "This is nicer than where I came from," Sarah admitted, running her fingers over the smooth cotton bedspread. "Most girls say that," Mrs. Henderson replied. "Morrison's not completely heartless, and he knows that girls who feel comfortable work better than those who feel like prisoners. Within limits, of course." A knock at the door interrupted them, and a young woman entered carrying an armload of clothing. She was perhaps 20 years old, with bleached blonde hair and makeup that couldn't quite hide the shadows under her eyes. "This is Ruby," Mrs. Henderson said. "She'll help you get ready and show you the ropes. Ruby, this is Sarah. Be gentle with her. It's her first time away from home." Ruby's smile was warm despite the hardness that experience had carved into her features. "Don't worry, honey. It's scary at first, but you'll figure it out. We all do." After Mrs. Henderson left, Ruby helped Sarah out of her homemade mountain dress and into clothing that transformed her appearance completely. The corset pushed up what little figure she had, while the low-cut blouse and short skirt revealed more skin than Sarah had ever shown in public. Stockings and garters completed the outfit, along with shoes that had small heels designed to make her legs appear longer and straighter. "The trick with your crutch," Ruby explained, "is to make it part of your appeal rather than something to hide. Some men find it interesting. Makes them feel strong and protective." Sarah studied herself in the mirror, barely recognizing the person staring back. The clothing was garish by mountain standards, but it served its purpose of creating an illusion of sophistication and availability. "How long have you been here?" Sarah asked as Ruby applied cosmetics with practiced efficiency. 3 years, Ruby replied. "Came from a farm in Kentucky when I was 17. Different circumstances than you, but same result. You learn to make the best of it. Do you ever think about leaving?" Ruby paused in her application of rouge, meeting Sarah's eyes in the mirror. "Every day, but thinking and doing are different things. Where would I go? What would I do? This is the only life I know now." The resignation in Ruby's voice was more frightening than any threat Morrison could have made. Sarah saw her own potential. Future reflected in this young woman who had given up hope of anything better. Over the following days, Sarah learned the routines and rituals of life at the Blue Moon Hotel. She discovered that the establishment operated according to strict schedules and hierarchies, with Mrs. Henderson maintaining order through a combination of maternal concern and iron discipline. The other girls, there were 6 in total, represented various stages of resignation to their circumstances. Some, like Ruby, had been there for years and had developed protective emotional shells that allowed them to function. Others were newer and still struggled with the gap between their childhood dreams and their current reality. Sarah's introduction to the work itself came gradually. Mrs. Henderson started her with simple tasks, serving drinks in the parlor, engaging in conversation with customers, providing companionship that didn't necessarily involve physical intimacy. Her disability, combined with her obvious inexperience, seemed to trigger protective instincts in many of the men who frequented the establishment. "You're getting special treatment," observed Dolores, a redhead in her mid-20s who had been at the Blue Moon longer than anyone except Mrs. Henderson. "Most new girls don't get a week to adjust. Mrs. Henderson says some customers prefer the gradual approach," Sarah replied, though she suspected the delay had more to do with her obvious terror than any business strategy. Her first real test came on a rainy Thursday evening when a middle-aged miner named Frank Peterson requested her specific company for the evening. Peterson was a regular customer known for his gentle manner and his preference for conversation over more physical services. "Don't look so scared," he said kindly as they settled in the parlor with glasses of whiskey. "I just want someone to Talk to who reminds me of my daughter back home. Peterson spoke about his family in Ohio, his struggles to earn enough money to bring them to West Virginia, and his loneliness in the mining camps. Sarah found herself genuinely moved by his story, and discovered that listening with sincere interest came naturally to her. "You're different from the other girls," Peterson observed after an hour of conversation. "More genuine somehow. Like you haven't forgotten how to care about people." Sarah realized that her disability, which had always made her feel defective, might actually be an asset in this environment. Men who came to places like the Blue Moon often craved authentic human connection more than physical gratification, and her obvious vulnerability made such connections feel safer for them. As weeks passed, Sarah developed a small but steady clientele of men who sought her out specifically for her combination of innocence and empathy. She learned to navigate the complex emotional needs of customers while protecting her own psychological well-being through careful, compartmentalization. Mrs. Henderson watched this development with interest and increasing approval. "You've got natural instincts for this work," she told Sarah one morning over coffee. "Not the physical part necessarily, but the emotional labor that keeps customers coming back." "Is that supposed to be a compliment?" Sarah asked. "In this business, it's the highest compliment possible. Physical beauty fades, but the ability to make lonely men feel understood and valued, that's rare and valuable." Sarah had been at the Blue Moon for nearly 2 months when Jake Morrison returned for his promised inspection. He found her in the parlor during the quiet afternoon hours, reading a book that one of her customers had brought her. Well, Morrison said, settling into the chair across from her. "Look at you. Mrs. Henderson tells me you're becoming quite popular with the clientele." "I try to do my job well," Sarah replied carefully. "Yes, I'm sure you do. The question is whether you're doing the right job. Mrs. Henderson's been coddling you, letting you play parlor maid instead of earning your keep properly." Sarah felt ice form in her stomach as she recognized the predatory gleam returning to Morrison's eyes. She had allowed herself to hope that her current arrangement might continue indefinitely, but Morrison's visit suggested otherwise. "I bring in money," Sarah said. "My customers are satisfied with my services. Some customers, perhaps. But there are others who prefer more complete service from their companions. I've had specific requests for you, Sarah, from men willing to pay premium prices for a girl with your particular appeal." The threat was clear, and Sarah understood that her period of relative protection was ending. Morrison had allowed her time to adjust, but now he intended to collect full value from his investment. "Mrs. Henderson said," Sarah began. "Mrs. Henderson works for me," Morrison cut her off. "She provides excellent management, but I make the final decisions about how my girls are utilized. And I've decided that it's time for you to expand your services." That evening, as Sarah lay in her small room listening to the sounds of business being conducted throughout the hotel, she finally allowed herself to acknowledge how desperate her situation had become. She had survived the initial shock of her circumstances and even found ways to maintain some dignity within them. But Morrison's return meant that worse degradation lay ahead. For the first time since arriving at the Blue Moon, Sarah seriously considered the alternatives Mrs. Henderson had warned her about. Running away would be dangerous and probably futile, but continuing to submit to Morrison's demands might destroy whatever remained of her soul. As she drifted toward troubled sleep, Sarah found herself thinking about the mountains of her childhood and wondering if anyone there ever thought about the girl who had disappeared for $2. She doubted it. People like her weren't missed for long in places where survival consumed all available energy. But somewhere in those mountains, she would later discover, a gentle giant was already moving toward a confrontation that would change both their lives forever. 40 miles northeast of Beckley, in the remote wilderness where the Appalachian Mountains reach toward heaven like the gnarled fingers of ancient gods, Samuel Bear Hawkins worked his trap lines in the preyed-on darkness. At 6 feet 5 inches and weighing nearly 300 pounds, Bear moved through the forest with surprising grace, his massive frame navigating fallen logs and rocky outcroppings with the confidence of a man who had spent 34 years learning every secret the mountains had to teach. Bear's cabin sat in a clearing he had carved from the wilderness 5 years earlier, after returning from Korea with shrapnel in his leg and memories that made sleep a luxury he couldn't always afford. The structure was built from logs he had felled himself, chinked with clay from the creek bottom, and heated by a stone fireplace whose chimney drew so well that smoke never lingered in the single large room that served as kitchen, parlor, and workshop. Most people in the scattered mountain communities knew Bear by reputation rather than personal acquaintance. He appeared in town perhaps once a month to trade pelts for supplies, conducting his business with quiet efficiency before disappearing back into the wilderness. Children whispered stories about the giant hermit who could track a deer for 20 miles and trap enough game to feed a family through the harshest winter. Adults spoke of him with the respectful wariness reserved for forces of nature, powerful, unpredictable, but generally benevolent if left undisturbed. What none of them knew was that Bear's self-imposed isolation stemmed not from misanthropy, but from a profound gentleness that had been repeatedly wounded by human cruelty. As a child in the coal camps, he had endured mockery and fear from peers who saw only his unusual size. As a soldier in Korea, he had witnessed horrors that reinforced his belief that civilization's veneer was thin and easily stripped away. Mountains offered him peace, purpose, and the absence of judgment that human society had never provided. Bear's morning routine was interrupted by an unusual sound, the desperate whimpering of an animal in distress. Following the sound to a ravine near his southern trapline, he discovered a young doe caught in a snare that wasn't his own. The trap was poorly constructed and cruelly designed, causing maximum suffering rather than the quick death that ethical trapping required. As Bear carefully freed the injured animal, his jaw tightened with anger. He recognized the snare's construction as the work of the Bradley brothers, a family of poachers who had been contaminating his territory with their sloppy, brutal traps for several months. The Bradleys operated out of a ramshackle camp about 10 miles south, closer to the roads that led to Beckley, and they had been steadily encroaching on the wilderness areas that Bear considered his responsibility to protect. After tending to the doe's injuries and releasing her back into the wild, Bear spent the morning systematically destroying every Bradley trap he could find. Their snares were not only cruel but also ineffective, designed by men who viewed hunting as an excuse for violence rather than a necessary communion with nature. By noon, he had collected enough evidence of their activities to warrant a direct confrontation. The Bradley camp was exactly what Bear had expected, a collection of makeshift shelters, surrounded by the detritus of men who took what they wanted without consideration for consequences. Empty whiskey bottles gleamed among animal bones and discarded equipment, while the stench of improperly processed hides fouled the air for hundreds of yards in every direction. Bear found the 3 Bradley brothers lounging around a smoldering fire, passing a bottle and boasting about their recent activities in town. They were small, wiry men with the feral alertness of predators, and they tensed visibly when Bear's massive silhouette emerged from the tree line. "Gentlemen," Bear said, his deep voice carrying easily across the clearing, "we need to discuss your trapping methods." The oldest Bradley brother, a scarred man named Clem, stood slowly and spat into the fire. "Don't recall asking for your opinion, Hawkins. This here's a free country, and we'll trap wherever we damn well please." "Not on my territory," Bear replied calmly, "and not with equipment designed to torture rather than kill cleanly. I've removed 17 of your snares this morning. Consider this your only warning." The middle brother, Roy, laughed and reached for the rifle leaning against a nearby stump. Big words from a man standing alone against 3 armed opponents. Bear's expression didn't change, but something in his stillness made all three brothers hesitate. Men who had survived by violence developed instincts about danger, and every instinct they possessed was suddenly screaming warnings about the giant standing at the edge of their camp. "Put the rifle down, Roy," Bear said quietly. "I didn't come here for a fight, but I'm prepared for one if that's what you choose." For a long moment, the clearing balanced on the edge of violence. Then the youngest Bradley brother, Pete, cleared his throat nervously. "Maybe we should hear him out, Clem. He ain't bothering nobody up in his woods." Clem's eyes never left Bear's face as he considered his options. Finally, he jerked his head toward his brothers. "We'll move our lines south of the creek. But this territory ain't big enough for all of us, Hawkins. Sooner or later, we're going to have ourselves a reckoning." "Perhaps," Bear agreed, "but not today." As Bear disappeared back into the forest, he carried with him more than just the satisfaction of protecting his hunting grounds. The confrontation had reminded him of how much he missed human interaction, even conflict, and it had awakened a restlessness that had been growing stronger with each passing month. That evening, as Bear prepared his simple dinner and listened to the familiar sounds of the wilderness settling into darkness, he found himself thinking about the lights of Beckley twinkling in the distance. He hadn't visited the town in nearly 2 months, and his supplies were running low enough to justify a trading expedition. More importantly, something was drawing him towards civilization with an intensity he couldn't quite explain. 3 days later, Bear loaded his packhorse with the best pelts from his recent trapping and began the long journey down the mountain toward Beckley. The trip normally took most of a day, following deer paths and creek beds that avoided the main roads where his appearance might cause unnecessary attention. Bear's relationship with Beckley was purely transactional. He dealt with Maxwell Trading Post, whose owner, Old Tom Maxwell, had served in World War I and respected Bear's military service enough to conduct business without unnecessary questions or conversation. Tom paid fair prices for quality pelts and stocked the supplies that Bear needed for his mountain existence: ammunition, salt, sugar, coffee, and the occasional book to occupy his long winter evenings. On this particular visit, however, Bear's usual routine was interrupted by an unexpected encounter. As he emerged from Maxwell's trading post with his purchases secured in saddlebags, he heard a commotion from the direction of the Blue Moon Hotel, raised voices and the sound of a struggle carried across the evening air, followed by a woman's cry of pain that cut through Bear's consciousness like a blade. Every instinct told him to mount his horse and return to the safety of the mountains, where other people's troubles couldn't entangle him in complications he wasn't equipped to handle. But the cry came again, desperate and terrified, and Bear found himself walking toward the source of the disturbance despite his better judgment. The alley behind the Blue Moon Hotel was poorly lit, but Bear could clearly see 3 figures silhouetted against the building's rear wall. 2 men had cornered a young woman, and even in the dim light, Bear could see that she was struggling to defend herself while hampered by what appeared to be a walking aid of some kind. "Come on now, Sarah," one of the men was saying in a voice that carried false reasonableness. "Morrison's got big plans for you, and fighting ain't going to make things easier for anybody." "I won't do it," the woman replied, her voice shaking, but determined. "I've done everything else you've asked, but I won't do that." "You don't get to choose anymore, cripple girl," the second man snarled. "Morrison owns you, and he's tired of you putting on airs like you're better than the rest of us." Bear recognized the dynamics at play even without understanding the specific circumstances. 2 predators were using their physical advantage to force compliance from someone vulnerable, and the injustice of it ignited something in his chest that had been dormant for too long. "Gentlemen," Bear said, stepping into the alley with deliberate calm. "The lady appears to be in distress." Both men spun toward him, their hands moving instinctively toward weapons. In the dim light, Bear's enormous silhouette must have seemed like something conjured from nightmare, and he could see fear replace aggression in their postures. "This ain't your business, stranger," the first man said, though his voice had lost its earlier confidence. "Just keep walking and forget what you seen." "I'm afraid I can't do that," Bear replied, moving closer with the unhurried confidence of a man who had never lost a physical confrontation. "The lady said no, and where I come from, that's the end of the discussion." The second man pulled a knife, the blade glinting in the weak light from the hotel's windows. "You best back off, mountain man. There's two of us and only one of you." Bear's laugh was soft and utterly without humor. "I like those odds." What followed was brief and decisive. The man with the knife lunged forward, only to find his wrist caught in a grip that crushed bones like kindling. His scream echoed off the alley walls as the blade clattered to the ground. The second man tried to flee, but Bear's free hand caught him by the collar and lifted him completely off his feet. "If I see either of you near this lady again," Bear said conversationally, as if he weren't holding two grown men helpless, "I'll demonstrate some techniques I learned in Korea. They're considerably less pleasant than what just happened here." Both men nodded frantically, and Bear released them to scramble away into the darkness, clutching their injuries and casting terrified glances over their shoulders. Bear turned toward the young woman, who had pressed herself against the alley wall and was staring at him with an expression that mixed gratitude with uncertainty. In the dim light, he could see that she was young, perhaps 18 or 19, with dark hair and large eyes that held pain far older than her years. The walking aid was indeed a crutch, and she held it defensively as if it might provide protection against further assault. "Are you hurt?" Bear asked gently, keeping his distance to avoid frightening her further. No, I don't think so," she replied, her voice soft with the accent of the mountain people Bear knew so well. "Thank you. They would have ... She didn't finish the sentence, but Bear could imagine what those men had intended. The circumstances suggested connections to the establishment whose reputation he knew by hearsay, and his jaw tightened as he considered what this young woman's life must entail. "My name is Samuel Hawkins," he said. "Most people call me Bear. What's your name?" "Sarah," she replied hesitantly. "Sarah Coleman." The name stirred something in Bear's memory, and after a moment, he placed it. Old Tom Maxwell had mentioned the Coleman family in passing mountain people who had fallen on hard times after the father took to drinking. There had been talk of a daughter, but Bear hadn't paid close attention to the gossip. "Coleman from Blackwater Hollow?" Bear asked. Sarah's expression shifted, surprise mixing with something that might have been shame. "You know my family? I know of them. Tom Maxwell mentioned your father some months back. Said he'd lost his way after your mother passed." Sarah's laugh was bitter and broken. "That's one way to put it. He lost his way right into a bottle, and when that wasn't enough, he lost me too." The pain in her voice hit Bear like a physical blow, and suddenly the pieces of her situation began forming a picture that made his hands clench into fists. A desperate father, a vulnerable daughter, and men like Morrison who profited from human misery. It was a story as old as civilization and as fresh as yesterday's cruelty. "Sarah," Bear said carefully, "do you have somewhere safe to go tonight?" She shook her head, and Bear saw tears glinting in her eyes. "This is where I live now. This is where I have to live." The resigned despair in her voice made Bear's decision for him. He had spent 5 years hiding in the mountains, avoiding the complications and pain that came with caring about other people. But looking at this young woman, broken by circumstances beyond her control, brave enough to resist further degradation despite the consequences, he knew that his isolation was ending whether he was ready for it or not. "No," Bear said quietly. "It's not." Sarah stared at the mountain giant standing in the alley, his words echoing in her mind like a prayer she was afraid to believe. "No, it's not." Those 3 simple words carried more hope than she had felt since her mother's death. But hope had become a dangerous luxury in her world. "I don't understand," Sarah whispered. clutching her crutch tighter as if it could anchor her to reality. "What do you mean?" Bear studied her face in the dim light, seeing past the garish makeup and revealing clothes to the frightened girl beneath. Everything about her posture spoke of someone who had learned to expect betrayal from every offer of kindness, and he recognized the careful distance she maintained, even while accepting his help. "I mean, you don't have to go back in there," Bear said gently. "There are other choices, other places you can go." Sarah's laugh held no humor, only the bitter wisdom of hard experience. "Mr. Hawkins, you don't understand. Morrison owns me. Legally. Owns me. My father sold me to him for $2, and the law says that makes me his property until the debt is paid." "The law," Bear said quietly, "and what's right aren't always the same thing." Before Sarah could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed from the mouth of the alley. Mrs. Henderson appeared, flanked by two men Sarah didn't recognize, clearly hired muscle brought in to handle the situation that had gotten out of hand. "Sarah, honey," Mrs. Henderson called, her voice carrying the false sweetness she used when angry customers needed to be pacified. "Time to come inside. Mr. Morrison's been asking for you." Bear stepped slightly forward, positioning himself between Sarah and the approaching group. The movement was subtle but unmistakable, and Mrs. Henderson's eyes narrowed as she took in his massive frame and protective stance. "And you are?" Mrs. Henderson inquired, her tone shifting to the carefully neutral voice she used with potentially dangerous men. "Samuel Hawkins," Bear replied. "I was just helping Miss Coleman after she was assaulted by two of your employees." "Assaulted?" Mrs. Henderson's eyebrows rose in theatrical surprise. "I'm sure there's been some misunderstanding. Sarah's just a bit nervous about her new responsibilities, but that's natural for a girl in her position." The euphemism made Bear's jaw tighten, but he kept his voice level. "Miss Coleman appears to be in distress. Perhaps she needs some time to consider her options." "Her options?" Mrs. Henderson's laugh was sharp and cold. "Mr. Hawkins, I don't think you understand the situation here. Sarah has certain obligations, financial and otherwise, that need to be fulfilled. Morrison's been more than patient, but his patience has limits." Bear could feel Sarah trembling beside him, and when he glanced down, he saw terror written across her features. She wasn't just afraid of Morrison or his men. She was afraid of hope itself, afraid to believe that escape might be possible. What if those obligations were transferred? Bear asked quietly. The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Mrs. Henderson's expression sharpened with interest. "Transferred how?" "Morrison paid $2 for her father's debt. What if someone else paid Morrison a fair price for her contract?" Sarah gasped softly, turning to stare at Bear with wide eyes. The idea that someone might be willing to buy her freedom seemed as impossible as flying to the moon. Mrs. Henderson studied Bear with new interest, clearly calculating his potential value as a customer versus the complications he might create. That would be a matter for Mr. Morrison to decide. He's very particular about his business arrangements. Then, "Perhaps I should speak with Mr. Morrison directly," Bear said. "He's not here tonight," Mrs. Henderson replied. "But I could arrange a meeting tomorrow if you're serious about this transaction." Bear reached into his coat and pulled out a leather pouch that clinked softly with the sound of coins. "I'm serious enough to make a down payment tonight, as a gesture of good faith." The sight of actual money changed the entire dynamic of the conversation. Mrs. Henderson's hostility evaporated, replaced by the calculating friendliness of a businesswoman sensing profit. "Well," she said slowly, "I suppose Sarah could spend the night considering her options, as long as appropriate arrangements are made for her security." "She'll be perfectly safe," Bear said firmly. "You have my word on that." What followed was a negotiation that felt surreal to Sarah, as if she were watching someone else's life unfold rather than participating in her own rescue. Bear and Mrs. Henderson discussed terms and conditions with the casual efficiency of people haggling over livestock, while Sarah stood silent and shaking, afraid to believe that freedom might actually be within reach. Finally, Mrs. Henderson nodded and extended her hand toward Bear. 24 hours, she said. Sarah can leave with you tonight, but if Morrison doesn't agree to your terms by this time tomorrow, she comes back. And Mr. Hawkins, if anything happens to her while she's in your care, you'll answer to Morrison personally. The threat was clear, but Bear simply nodded and shook the offered hand. Understood. As they prepared to leave, Sarah realized she had no possessions to collect except the small bag she had brought from her father's cabin months earlier. Everything else, the gaudy clothes, the makeup, the carefully constructed persona that had been her survival strategy, belonged to the Blue Moon Hotel and the life she was leaving behind. Bear's horse was a massive draft animal named Thunder, calm enough to handle his rider's unusual size and gentle enough not to be startled by the addition of an unexpected passenger. Bear helped Sarah onto the horse's broad back, her crutch secured alongside the saddlebags, before mounting behind her. Where are we going? Sarah asked as they rode away from the lights of Beckley toward the dark mountains beyond. Somewhere you can think clearly, Bear replied. Somewhere no one can hurt you while you decide what you want to do with your life. The ride up into the mountains took nearly 3 hours, following paths that were barely visible in the moonlight. Sarah had never been this far from civilization, and the vast silence of the wilderness was both frightening and strangely comforting after months of living surrounded by the constant noise and activity of the brothel. Bear's cabin appeared suddenly, in a clearing that seemed carved from a fairy tale, surrounded by towering pines and overlooked by peaks that caught the moonlight like silver crowns. The structure was larger than Sarah had expected, built with the careful craftsmanship of someone who took pride in his work and planned to live with the results for many years. It's beautiful, Sarah breathed, and she meant it. After months of ugly surroundings that reflected the ugliness of her circumstances, the simple beauty of Bear's mountain sanctuary felt like a gift. Bear helped her down from the horse and handed her the crutch, then began unloading supplies while she stood in the clearing, overwhelmed by the silence and the clean smell of pine needles and mountain air. Are you hungry? Bear asked as he led her toward the cabin. I've got stew that's been simmering all day, and fresh bread I baked this morning. The offer of food prepared with care rather than simply purchased or traded was another small miracle. Sarah realized she couldn't remember the last time someone had cooked for her rather than expecting her to serve them. The cabin's interior was a revelation. One large room served multiple functions, but everything was arranged with military precision and surprising comfort. Books lined shelves built into the walls, indicating an education that surprised Sarah. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, while a well-equipped kitchen occupied another corner. The furniture was handmade but skillfully crafted, designed for comfort as well as function. You built all this yourself? Sarah asked, lowering herself carefully into a chair that had been sized for Bear's large frame but felt wonderfully stable and comfortable. Most of it, Bear replied, ladling stew into 2 bowls. Had some help raising the walls and setting the roof beams, but the detail work was mine. As they shared the simple meal, Sarah found herself studying her unexpected rescuer with growing curiosity. Bear moved with the careful economy of someone accustomed to solitude, but his table manners and speech patterns suggested education and refinement that contrasted sharply with his mountain man appearance. Mrs. Henderson called you Mr. Hawkins, Sarah said finally. But you said people call you Bear. Samuel Hawkins is my given name, Bear explained. Bear is what the men in my unit called me in Korea. The name stuck when I came back. You were in the war? Bear nodded, but his expression suggested it wasn't a subject he enjoyed discussing. 3 years. Came home in 1952 with enough savings to buy this land and build the cabin. Sarah sensed pain beneath his brief explanation, the kind of wounds that didn't show on the surface but affected everything underneath. She recognized it because she carried similar wounds herself. "Why did you help me tonight?" she asked quietly. "You don't know me, and getting involved could cause you serious trouble with Morrison." Bear was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire as if it held answers to questions he was still working out himself. "Because you reminded me that hiding from the world doesn't make it any better," he said finally. "Because what those men were doing to you was wrong, and I've spent too many years telling myself that other people's problems weren't my responsibility. And now? Now I think maybe some problems become your responsibility the moment you become aware of them." After dinner, Bear prepared a sleeping area for Sarah near the fireplace, insisting she take his bed while he made do with a bedroll on the floor. The gesture was both practical and symbolic evidence that he saw her as a guest deserving of respect, rather than an object to be used. As Sarah lay in the comfortable bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the wilderness settling into night, she found herself crying for the first time since leaving her father's cabin. But these weren't tears of despair or fear. They were tears of relief, gratitude, and something she was afraid to name because it felt too much like hope. For the first time in months, Sarah fell asleep without fear of what tomorrow might bring. Outside the cabin, Bear sat by the dying fire, keeping watch and wondering what he had gotten himself into. He had acted on instinct in that alley, responding to injustice the same way he would respond to any threat in his wilderness domain. But morning would bring consequences that would test his commitment to the principles that had guided his intervention. Morrison would come, bringing lawyers and threats and the full weight of a system that treated vulnerable people as property. Bear would need to be ready for that confrontation, not just with money, but with the kind of strategic thinking that had kept him alive in Korea and in the unforgiving mountains. But as he listened to Sarah's quiet breathing from inside the cabin, Bear knew that regardless of the cost, he couldn't let her return to the life she had been forced to live. Some things were worth fighting for, and the right of every person to be treated with dignity was one of them. Tomorrow would bring challenges that would test them both. But tonight, in the sanctuary he had built from logs and determination, two wounded souls had found unexpected refuge in each other's company. And sometimes, Bear reflected, that was how healing began, not with grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but with simple acts of kindness offered without expectation of reward. Sarah woke to the sound of birdsong and the gentle crackling of a fire being carefully tended. For a moment, she lay still with her eyes closed, afraid that opening them would reveal the familiar squalor of her room at the Blue Moon Hotel. But the air smelled of pine and wood smoke instead of cheap perfume and stale cigarettes, and the bed beneath her was comfortable rather than merely functional. When she finally opened her eyes, Sarah saw Bear moving quietly around the cabin, preparing what appeared to be breakfast while trying not to disturb her rest. Sunlight streamed through clean windows, illuminating a space that looked even more impressive in daylight than it had the night before. "Good morning," Bear said softly, noticing she was awake. "How did you sleep?" "Better than I have in months," Sarah replied honestly, struggling to sit up without her crutch, which Bear had placed within easy reach beside the bed. "Thank you for everything." Bear handed her a cup of coffee that smelled better than anything she could remember tasting. "We need to talk about what happens next," he said gently. "Morrison will be expecting an answer today." The reminder of her situation sent a chill through Sarah, despite the cabin's warmth. In the beauty and safety of Bear's mountain sanctuary, she had almost been able to forget that her freedom was temporary, purchased with borrowed time rather than genuine liberation. "How much money do you have?" Sarah asked bluntly. "Because Morrison won't settle for just the $2 my father received. He's invested in me, trained me, provided room and board. He'll want compensation for his losses." Bear sat down across from her with his own coffee, considering her question carefully. "I have some savings from my military service, plus income from trapping and trading." The question isn't whether I can afford to buy your freedom, it's whether you want me to. Sarah stared at him in confusion. What do you mean? I mean, this has to be your choice, Bear said firmly. I won't trade one form of ownership for another, even with good intentions. If I pay Morrison, it has to be with the understanding that you're free to make your own decisions about your life. The concept was so foreign to Sarah's recent experience that she struggled to process it. For months, her choices had been limited to compliance or punishment, with even small acts of resistance carrying severe consequences. The idea that someone might purchase her freedom without expecting anything in return seemed impossible. People don't do things like that, Sarah said quietly. There's always a price, always something expected in return. Then maybe it's time. You met different people, Bear replied. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of horses approaching the cabin. Through the window, Sarah could see a small group of riders making their way up the mountain trail. Morrison, flanked by two men she recognized as his enforcers, and a fourth man in an expensive suit who could only be a lawyer. They're early, Bear observed, rising to check his rifle, which leaned against the wall near the door. Morrison must be more concerned about this situation than Mrs. Henderson let on. Sarah felt panic rising in her chest as she watched the riders approach. He'll never let me go. He's got too much invested, and he can't afford to look weak in front of the other girls. Let me handle Morrison, Bear said calmly. But Sarah, I need to know, do you want to be free of him? Really free, not just traded from one master to another? Yes, Sarah whispered, then stronger. Yes, I want to be free. Bear nodded and stepped outside to meet their visitors, leaving Sarah to watch through the window as one of the most important conversations of her life unfolded in his front yard. Morrison dismounted with the casual arrogance of a man accustomed to getting his way through intimidation and legal maneuvering. He was dressed in his finest clothes, clearly intending to project authority and respectability, but his presence still carried the underlying threat that had terrified Sarah since their first meeting. Mr. Hawkins, Morrison called out, his voice carrying the false friendliness he used when conducting business. I understand you've developed an interest in one of my employees. I've developed an interest in seeing Miss Coleman treated with basic human dignity, Bear replied evenly. Something that seems to have been lacking in her recent experiences. The lawyer, a thin, nervous man who clearly preferred his battles fought in courtrooms rather than mountain clearings, stepped forward with a leather briefcase. Mr. Hawkins, I'm Attorney Williamson, representing Mr. Morrison's business interests. I think there may be some misunderstanding about the legal situation here. Enlighten me, Bear said. Williamson withdrew a sheaf of papers from his briefcase. Miss Coleman is bound by a legally executed contract signed by her father as her legal guardian. She owes Mr. Morrison compensation for transportation, room, board, clothing, and training expenses that amount to considerably more than the original purchase price. How much? Bear asked bluntly. Morrison smiled, sensing victory. $200. Plus interest and penalties for breach of contract if she fails to fulfill her obligations. The amount was staggering by mountain standards, more than most families saw in cash during an entire year. Morrison had clearly inflated every possible expense to make Sarah's freedom prohibitively expensive. That seems excessive for a few months of room and board, Bear observed. Specialized training is expensive, Morrison replied smoothly, and Miss Coleman's particular requirements necessitated special accommodations that increased the overall investment. Bear was quiet for a long moment, and Sarah could see him calculating options and consequences. $200 would represent most of his savings, money he had earned through years of dangerous work in brutal conditions. No reasonable person would impoverish themselves for a stranger, especially one with as many complications as her situation presented. I'll need to see the contract, Bear said finally. Williamson handed over the documents with obvious satisfaction. confident that the legal language would discourage any further resistance. Bear read through the papers carefully, his expression revealing nothing about his thoughts. This contract was signed by Thomas Coleman, Bear said after several minutes. What authority did he have to bind his adult daughter to such terms? Miss Coleman was a minor when the contract was executed, Williamson replied. And even now, as an unmarried woman with no independent means of support, she remains under the legal authority of her male guardian, who is currently Mr. Morrison. Having assumed guardianship through the debt transfer, Morrison added with obvious satisfaction, Sarah felt sick as she listened to her life being reduced to legal terminology and financial calculations. She had known that the law offered little protection to women in her situation, but hearing it laid out so clearly was crushing. Bear handed the papers back to Williamson. Interesting legal theory. Let me propose a counter-argument. From inside the cabin, Sarah couldn't hear the details of what Bear said next, but she could see the effect of his words on Morrison and his associates. The lawyer's confident expression shifted to concern, while Morrison's smugness gave way to anger. "You can't be serious," Morrison snapped. "No magistrate in West Virginia would accept such a claim." "Perhaps not," Bear agreed. "But I know several federal judges who take a dim view of contracts that amount to legalized slavery. The 13th Amendment abolished involuntary servitude, Mr. Morrison, and I suspect that includes forcing women into prostitution through manufactured debt." Williamson paled at the mention of federal intervention. Small-town corruption could usually contain local scandals, but federal attention would expose practices that thrived only in darkness. "What are you proposing?" Morrison asked through gritted teeth. $50, Bear said calmly. "Fair compensation for legitimate expenses, with Miss Coleman's freedom guaranteed in writing. No future claims, no continuing obligations, no threats or retaliation." "That's less than a quarter of what she owes," Morrison protested. "It's more than she actually owes for basic necessities," Bear corrected. "The rest is artificial inflation designed to ensure permanent bondage." The negotiation that followed was tense and complicated, with Morrison and Williamson arguing legal precedents while Bear countered with threats of federal investigation and public exposure. Sarah watched through the window, her heart pounding, as her fate was decided by men whose primary concern was protecting their own interests. Finally, Morrison threw up his hands in frustration. $75, and that's my final offer. Take it, or I'll tie this up in court for years." "Agreed," Bear said immediately, producing a leather pouch from his coat. "With the understanding that Miss Coleman is free to go wherever she chooses and live however she sees fit." "Fine," Morrison snarled, clearly unhappy but recognizing that further argument would only increase his legal exposure. "But Hawkins, if she comes crawling back to Beckley looking for work, don't expect any special treatment." "She won't be coming back," Bear said, with quiet certainty. As Williamson prepared new paperwork documenting Sarah's freedom, Morrison and his men remounted their horses with obvious displeasure. The transaction had cost Morrison not just money but face, and his parting glare promised that he wouldn't soon forget the humiliation. "This isn't over," Morrison called out as they prepared to leave. "People like her always end up where they belong eventually." "People like her," Bear replied calmly, "deserve better than people like you." After the riders disappeared down the mountain trail, Bear returned to the cabin where Sarah sat trembling with reaction. She had watched her freedom being purchased like a commodity, but the reality of what had just happened was almost too overwhelming to process. "It's done," Bear said gently, sitting down beside her. "You're free, Sarah, legally and completely free." Sarah stared at him through tears she couldn't control. $75. "You spent $75 on someone you met yesterday." "I spent $75 on doing what was right," Bear corrected. "The money's not important. It's just paper and metal. Your freedom, your dignity, your right to choose your own path, that's what matters." "But what do you expect from me now?" Sarah asked, the question that had been burning in her mind since the moment Bear first offered. "To help." "What do I owe you for this?" Bear's expression grew serious as he considered how to answer. "You owe me exactly what you owed Morrison after the debt was paid. Nothing. Your life belongs to you now, Sarah. You can stay here as long as you need to figure out what you want to do next, or you can leave tomorrow if that's what you prefer. The choice is entirely yours." The concept of genuine freedom, the right to make decisions without coercion or obligation, was so foreign to Sarah's recent experience that she struggled to believe it was real. But looking into Bear's honest eyes, she began to understand that some people really did act from kindness rather than self-interest. "I don't know how to be free," Sarah admitted quietly. "I've been someone's property since I was 14 years old. First my father's burden, then Morrison's investment. I don't know how to be just ... myself." "Then maybe," Bear said gently, "that's what we'll figure out together." Outside the cabin, the mountain wilderness stretched endlessly toward the horizon. Vast and beautiful and full of possibilities that Sarah was only beginning to imagine. For the first time in years, her future was unwritten, unlimited by anyone's expectations except her own. The transformation wouldn't be easy or immediate. Freedom was a skill that had to be learned like any other, and Sarah had years of damage to overcome. But sitting in the safety of Bear's Mountain Sanctuary, watching sunlight stream through clean windows onto a floor swept by caring hands, she began to believe that healing might actually be possible. And in the gentle strength of the man who had purchased her freedom without asking for anything in return, Sarah glimpsed the first example she had ever seen of love without conditions, protection without price, and kindness without hidden motives. The mountain had claimed her, and she was ready to let it transform her into someone she had never imagined she could become. The first week of Sarah's freedom passed in a strange suspension of time, where each morning brought the surprising realization that she was still safe, still welcome, still free to make choices about how to spend her day. Bear maintained a careful balance between offering companionship and respecting her need for solitude, understanding that healing required both support and space. Sarah spent long hours sitting on the cabin's front porch, watching the play of light and shadow across the mountain slopes, while trying to reconcile her new reality with the survival instincts that had kept her alive for months. Every sound of approaching footsteps made her tense. Every unexpected noise sent her heart racing, and she found herself constantly checking the horizon for signs of Morrison's return. "He's not coming back," Bear told her one morning, finding her standing at the window with obvious anxiety. "The legal documents are clear, and Morrison's too smart to risk federal attention by harassing you further." "You don't know him like I do," Sarah replied quietly. "He doesn't forgive people who make him look foolish, and he has connections throughout the state. Men like Morrison always find ways to get what they want." Bear recognized the bone-deep fear that trauma had carved into Sarah's worldview, and he understood that reassurance alone wouldn't heal wounds that had been months in the making. Instead, he began teaching her practical skills that might help restore her sense of agency and control. "Would you like to learn to shoot?" Bear asked one afternoon, producing a small rifle from his gun cabinet. "Living in the mountains requires certain abilities, and knowing how to protect yourself might help you feel more secure." Sarah's initial reaction was horror. The Blue Moon Hotel had taught her to fear weapons in the hands of violent men. But as Bear patiently explained gun safety and proper handling techniques, she began to see the rifle not as an instrument of intimidation, but as a tool that could level the playing field between herself and those who might wish her harm. First time Sarah successfully hit a target, Bear had set up 50 yards from the cabin. She felt a surge of pride and accomplishment that had nothing to do with anyone else's approval. The skill belonged to her, earned through her own effort and concentration, and no one could take it away. "You're a natural," Bear observed, watching her reload with growing confidence. "Good eye, steady hands, and the patience to line up your..." Shot properly. I never thought I could do something like this, Sarah admitted, examining the rifle with new respect. Growing up, guns were men's tools. Women weren't supposed to touch them. Mountain living has different rules, Bear said. Up here, survival matters more than social conventions. A person's worth isn't determined by their gender or their physical limitations. It's measured by their ability to contribute to their own well-being and that of their community. The concept of worth being earned rather than assigned was revolutionary to Sarah, who had spent her entire life being judged by circumstances beyond her control. In the mountains, her disability mattered less than her determination, her gender mattered less than her skills, and her past mattered less than her willingness to learn and grow. As the days passed, Sarah began taking on more responsibilities. Around the cabin, not because Bear expected it, but because purposeful work helped her feel grounded and valuable. She discovered that her experience managing household tasks in poverty had given her practical skills that translated well to mountain living. She could stretch supplies to last longer, improvise solutions to everyday problems, and maintain order in small spaces with limited resources. "You've got a gift for making things work," Bear told her one evening as they shared a dinner she had prepared from ingredients he had gathered during his daily hunting and foraging. "That stew tastes better than anything I've made in 5 years of living alone." Sarah felt warmth spread through her chest at the genuine appreciation in his voice. Compliments at the Blue Moon Hotel had always carried ulterior motives, but Bear's praise seemed to arise from simple gratitude for her contributions to their shared life. "I like having something useful to do," Sarah said. "At the hotel, everything I did was different, artificial. Here, when I cook or clean or mend clothes, it serves a real purpose." Bear nodded thoughtfully. "Purpose makes all the difference. In Korea, even the worst conditions were bearable when we understood why we were there and what we were fighting for. Without purpose, the same actions become meaningless suffering." It was one of the few times Bear had mentioned his military service without obvious pain, and Sarah sensed that their shared experience of trauma was creating a foundation for deeper understanding. "What was it like?" Sarah asked carefully. "Coming back from the war and trying to build a normal life?" Bear was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire as he considered how much truth to share. "Difficult," he said finally. "The person who went to Korea and the person who came back weren't the same, and civilian life felt hollow. People worrying about trivial things while acting like the serious things didn't exist. I couldn't find my place in that world." "So, you came to the mountains?" "I came to the mountains," Bear confirmed. "Built something that made sense to me, where I could be useful without having to pretend that the war never happened, or that the world was kinder than I knew it to be." Sarah understood the feeling of displacement he described, though her trauma had different origins. "Do you think that's what I'm doing here? Hiding from the world because it's too cruel to face?" Bear studied her face in the firelight, seeing intelligence and strength that were beginning to emerge as fear gradually subsided. "I think you're healing from wounds that would have destroyed someone with less courage. And I think you're learning skills and developing strength that will serve you well whether you choose to stay in the mountains or return to civilization." The conversation marked a turning point in Sarah's recovery. Instead of simply surviving from day to day, she began thinking about longer-term possibilities and making plans that extended beyond immediate safety. She asked Bear to teach her more advanced wilderness skills, how to track animals, identify edible plants, read weather patterns, and navigate by natural landmarks. Each new ability added to her sense of competence and self-reliance, building confidence that had been systematically destroyed during her time with Morrison. "You're getting stronger," Bear observed one afternoon as they returned from a successful hunting expedition where Sarah had made the shot that brought down the deer they would eat for the next week. "Not just physically, but mentally, you're starting to trust yourself again." Sarah considered his observation as they prepared their harvest, working together with the efficient coordination they had developed over weeks of shared tasks. I think I'm starting to remember who I was before everything went wrong. Or maybe discovering who I could have been if circumstances had been different. Who is that person? Bear asked gently. Sarah paused in her work, considering the question. Seriously, someone brave enough to make her own choices. Someone strong enough to help others who need protection. Someone worthy of being loved for who she is rather than what she can provide. The last part was whispered, as if speaking it aloud might make it disappear, but Bear heard every word. That person was always there, Bear said quietly. She was just buried under pain and fear and other people's cruelty. But she's emerging now, and she's remarkable. Sarah looked up to find Bear watching her with an expression she had never seen directed at her before, genuine admiration mixed with something deeper and warmer that made her heart skip. In that moment, she realized that her feelings toward her rescuer had evolved far beyond gratitude into something that felt dangerously like love. But love was complicated by everything she had experienced. And Sarah wasn't sure she was ready to trust her own emotions or Bear's motivations. The habit of suspicion had become a survival mechanism, and abandoning it felt like stepping off a cliff without knowing what lay below. That evening, as they sat by the fire reading books from Bear's extensive collection, Sarah found herself studying his profile and wondering what it would be like to be loved by someone like him. Not used or owned or controlled, but genuinely cherished for her own sake. Bear, she said suddenly, setting down her book. Why haven't you ever married? A man like you, kind, strong, successful. Surely there have been women who would have been happy to share your life. Bear marked his place in his book and set it aside, recognizing that this was a conversation that required his full attention. There have been a few women over the years who expressed interest, he said carefully. But military life doesn't lend itself to stable relationships, and after I came back, well, I wasn't the same person they thought they knew. How were you different? Harder, more serious, less willing to pretend that everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. The war changed my perspective on what mattered and what didn't, and most people found that change uncomfortable. Sarah nodded, understanding the isolation that came with seeing the world differently than those around you. Do you think that's why we understand each other? Because we've both been broken by experiences that other people can't comprehend. Maybe, Bear said. Or maybe we understand each other because we're both trying to rebuild ourselves into something better than what we were before the breaking happened. The conversation continued late into the night, covering topics they had both avoided since Sarah's arrival. They talked about loss and recovery, about the challenge of trusting others after betrayal, about the difference between healing and simply surviving. As the fire burned down to glowing embers, Sarah realized that she felt safer and more valued in Bear's presence than she had ever felt with another human being. He saw her disability as simply one aspect of who she was, rather than a defining limitation, treated her past as something to overcome rather than something shameful, and spoke to her intelligence and capabilities rather than patronizing her vulnerability. Thank you, Sarah said as they prepared for bed. Not just for rescuing me, but for helping me remember that I'm worth rescuing. Bear's smile was gentle and sad and hopeful all at once. Sarah, you were always worth rescuing. The tragedy is that it took so long for someone to see it. That night, as Sarah lay in the comfortable bed that had become her sanctuary, she allowed herself to imagine a future that included more than just survival. For the first time since her mother's death, she began to dream of happiness, partnership, and a love that healed rather than harmed. Outside her window, the mountain peak stood silhouetted against a star-filled sky, eternal and unchanging and somehow protective. She had found her place in this wilderness refuge, but more importantly, she was beginning to find herself. 2 months after Morrison's departure, Sarah had settled into a rhythm of mountain life that felt more natural than anything she had ever experienced. Her days were filled with purposeful work tending the vegetable garden she had planted behind the cabin, preserving food for winter, helping Bear with his trap lines, and continuing to develop skills that made her a valuable partner rather than a dependent. The morning that would test everything they had built together began like any other, with Sarah preparing breakfast while Bear checked the weather signs that would determine their activities for the day. The first hint of trouble came from Thunder, Bear's usually calm horse, who began showing signs of agitation unusual for the steady animal. "Something's got him spooked," Bear observed, stepping onto the porch to scan the tree line around their clearing. "Could be a bear or mountain cat, but Thunder's not usually bothered by wildlife." Sarah joined him outside, and together they listened to the forest sounds that had become as familiar as their own heartbeats. The normal chorus of birds and small animals seemed muted, replaced by an underlying tension that set both their nerves on edge. "There," Sarah whispered, pointing to a flash of movement in the trees about a quarter-mile down the mountain. "Someone's coming up the trail." Bear's expression hardened as he identified 3 figures making their way steadily toward the cabin. Even at a distance, he could see that they moved with the purposeful coordination of men accustomed to violence, and their route suggested familiarity with mountain travel, despite their obvious urban origins. "Get inside," Bear said quietly, his voice carrying the calm authority that had kept his men alive in Korea. "Take the rifle and position yourself where you can cover the back door. If shooting starts, don't hesitate to use it." Sarah's stomach clenched with familiar terror as she recognized the implications of Bear's instructions. The peaceful sanctuary they had created was about to become a battleground, and the freedom she had just begun to trust was once again under threat. "Who do you think they are?" Sarah asked as she moved toward the cabin, though part of her already knew the answer. "Morrison's men," Bear replied grimly. "He's decided that legal defeat isn't the end of this situation." Inside the cabin, Sarah positioned herself at a window that provided a clear view of the approaching visitors while keeping her largely hidden from their sight. The rifle felt familiar and comforting in her hands now, no longer the foreign instrument of violence it had been weeks earlier. The 3 men who emerged from the forest were strangers to Sarah, but their type was unmistakable hired guns brought in from outside the local area to handle problems that required plausible deniability. They were dressed for mountain travel, but carried themselves with the arrogant confidence of men who believed superior firepower could overcome any local advantage. Bear stepped off the porch to meet them, his massive frame relaxed but ready, hands positioned where he could reach his weapons quickly if necessary. Sarah could see the tactical calculations running through his mind as he assessed angles, cover, and escape routes with the automatic efficiency of a veteran soldier. "Gentlemen," Bear called out when the men were still 50 yards away. "That's close enough. State your business." The leader of the group, a lean man with the scarred hands of someone who had survived multiple violent encounters, smiled with cold amusement. "Samuel Hawkins, I presume. We're here about a business dispute involving one of Mr. Morrison's former employees." "Miss Coleman's situation was resolved legally and completely," Bear replied. "Morrison has no legitimate claim on her or any reason to send representatives to this property." "Ah, but that's where you're wrong," the gunman continued, producing a folded document from his coat. "Seems there was some fine print in that contract you didn't notice. A clause about restitution for training costs and lost business opportunities." Sarah felt ice form in her stomach as she listened to the conversation. She had feared that Morrison's acceptance of the settlement had been too easy, and it appeared her instincts had been correct. "Let me see that document," Bear said, extending his hand. "I'm afraid I can't let you handle the original," the gunman replied with mock courtesy, "but I can read you the relevant passage." It states that if Miss Coleman fails to complete her contracted term of service, she becomes liable for additional damages calculated at $5 per week for the remaining duration of her agreement. The math was staggering. Sarah's original contract had been for 5 years, meaning that at 2 months into her service, she would owe Morrison more than $1,200, a sum that would be impossible for most people to raise. That clause would never hold up in court, Bear said calmly. It constitutes usury and violates several federal statutes regarding debt peonage. Maybe so, the gunman agreed. But court proceedings take time, and Mr. Morrison needs his property returned immediately. He's prepared to be reasonable about the financial arrangements if Miss Coleman comes along quietly. Sarah watched Bear's hands shift slightly, moving closer to the pistol at his hip. The negotiation was breaking down exactly as she had feared. It would, with Morrison's men prepared to use violence to reclaim what they considered valuable property. Miss Coleman is under the protection of federal law, Bear said firmly. Any attempt to remove her from this property against her will constitute kidnapping and will be prosecuted accordingly. The gunman's laugh was harsh and contemptuous. Mr. Hawkins, we're standing in the middle of the wilderness, miles from the nearest federal authority. Laws don't mean much out here without someone to enforce them. I enforce them, Bear said. Quietly, and something in his tone made all 3 men reassess their tactical situation. The standoff stretched taut as both sides calculated advantages and risks. Sarah could see that Morrison's men had assumed they would be dealing with an isolated mountain hermit who could be easily intimidated. Instead, they found themselves facing a veteran soldier on his own territory, with every advantage that terrain and preparation could provide. We're prepared to be reasonable, the gunman said finally. Turn over the girl, and we'll forget about any complications that might arise from this conversation. Counter-proposal, Bear replied. You gentlemen turn around and walk back down that mountain, and I'll forget that you threatened a federal crime on my property. The tension exploded into violence with shocking suddenness. The gunman's hand moved toward his weapon, but Bear's military training gave him a crucial advantage in speed and precision. His pistol cleared leather and fired before any of Morrison's men could complete their draw. The shot echoing off the mountain slopes like thunder. The gunman spun and fell, clutching his shoulder while his companions dove for cover behind nearby trees. Bear was already moving, using his knowledge of the terrain to position himself where he could control the approaches to the cabin. Sarah, Bear called out, cover the back door. They'll try to flank us. Sarah's hands shook as she shifted position, but her training over the past weeks held firm. When she saw movement at the edge of the forest behind the cabin, she fired without hesitation. Her shot close enough to the intruder to send him scrambling back into cover. The gunfight that followed was brief but intense, with Morrison's remaining men discovering that their urban experience was inadequate for mountain warfare against an opponent who knew every rock and tree in the area. Bear used the terrain to his advantage, appearing and disappearing like a ghost while driving the attackers steadily away from the cabin. When the shooting finally stopped, one of Morrison's men was wounded and all 3 were retreating down the mountain trail considerably faster than they had ascended. The leader paused at the edge of the clearing to shout back at Bear. This isn't over, Hawkins. Morrison's got resources you can't imagine and connections that reach into every level of government. You've made an enemy who won't forget or forgive. Tell Morrison that if he sends anyone else up this mountain, they won't be walking back down. Bear replied calmly, reloading his pistol with practiced efficiency. After the attackers disappeared into the forest, Bear conducted a careful reconnaissance around the cabin to ensure they weren't planning an ambush or attempting to circle back. Only when he was satisfied that the immediate threat had passed did he return to check on Sarah. He found her sitting on the cabin floor, still holding the rifle but shaking with reaction to the violence she had witnessed and participated in. The calm competence she had displayed during the fight was giving way to the psychological aftermath of her first real combat experience. "It's over," Bear said gently, kneeling beside her and carefully taking the rifle from her trembling hands. "You did exactly what you needed to do, and you may have saved both our lives." "I shot at a human being," Sarah whispered, staring at her hands as if they belonged to someone else. "I actually pulled the trigger with the intention of hurting another person." "You defended yourself in your home," Bear corrected firmly. "Those men came here with the intention of kidnapping you and probably killing me. What you did was necessary and right." Sarah looked up at him with eyes that held a mixture of pride and horror. "Is this what the rest of my life is going to be? Like, always looking over my shoulder, always ready for the next attack?" Bear considered her question seriously, understanding that his answer would shape her decisions about their shared future. "Morrison will try again," he said honestly. "Men like him don't accept defeat gracefully, and today's humiliation will only make him more determined. But Sarah, you proved today that you're strong enough to fight for your freedom. That's not a burden, it's a gift." As they worked together to secure the cabin and tend to Bear's minor injuries from the firefight, Sarah found herself examining her feelings about the violence she had witnessed and participated in. The terror was real, but underneath it lay a fierce satisfaction at having successfully defended the life she had built in these mountains. "What do we do now?" Sarah asked as they shared a quiet dinner, both of them still processing the day's events. "We prepare," Bear said simply. "Morrison's shown his hand, and we know he won't stop with legal or illegal pressure. We need to be ready for whatever he sends next, and we need allies who can help us fight him on his own terms." The attack had changed something fundamental in their relationship. Sarah was no longer simply someone Bear was protecting, she was his partner, in a struggle that would define both their futures. The transformation from victim to warrior was complete, forged in the crucible of actual combat. That night, as they took turns keeping watch while the others slept, Sarah realized that her mountain sanctuary had become something more complex and dangerous. It was no longer just a refuge from the world's cruelty. It was a fortress they would defend together against those who sought to destroy what they had built. The girl who had been sold for $2 was gone forever, replaced by a woman who would fight for her freedom with everything she possessed. And beside her stood a man who had proven that some things were worth any sacrifice to protect. 3 weeks after Morrison's failed assault on their mountain sanctuary, Sarah stood in the kitchen of their cabin, carefully packing supplies for what would be their most dangerous journey yet. The decision to take the fight to Morrison rather than wait for his next attack had been mutual, born from the understanding that defensive victories were temporary while their enemy remained free to regroup and escalate. "The federal marshal will meet us in Charleston tomorrow evening," Bear said, checking his weapons one final time. "Agent Fletcher has been investigating Morrison's operation for months, and our testimony could provide the evidence needed to shut him down permanently." Sarah nodded, though her stomach churned with anxiety about returning to civilization and the legal system that had failed her so completely before. What if they don't believe us? What if Morrison's connections are stronger than federal law? Then we'll have tried the legal route before resorting to other measures, Bear replied grimly. "But Sarah, Fletcher seems genuine, and he's already gathered substantial evidence of Morrison's violations of federal anti-trafficking laws." The journey down from the mountains took 2 days, with overnight stops at settlements where Bear's reputation ensured them safe passage and honest treatment. Sarah watched the wilderness give way to farmland and then to the industrial sprawl of Charleston with mixed emotions, knowing that each mile brought them closer to a confrontation that would determine their future. Charleston in 1955 was a city caught between its coal mining past and an uncertain industrial future, with federal buildings and modern hotels rising alongside the older structures that spoke of earlier, simpler times. The federal courthouse where they would meet Agent Fletcher, represented the kind of institutional power that Sarah had learned to distrust, but it also offered the possibility of justice that mountain law couldn't provide. Agent Fletcher turned out to be a serious man in his 40s, with the careful manner of someone who had seen enough corruption to be cautious, but retained enough idealism to keep fighting it. He listened to their testimony with growing anger, taking detailed notes and asking probing questions that demonstrated his understanding of the criminal enterprises he was investigating. Morrison's operation is more extensive than you might realize, Fletcher explained as they concluded their formal statements. He's got similar establishments in 4 states, all operating under the protection of local officials who receive regular payments for their cooperation. So he really is untouchable? Sarah asked, fighting down the familiar despair that threatened to overwhelm her. Not untouchable, Fletcher corrected, just well protected at the local level. But federal jurisdiction supersedes local corruption, and we've been building a case that will bring down his entire network. The raid on the Blue Moon Hotel took place at dawn the following morning, with Sarah and Bear observing from a safe distance as federal agents systematically documented evidence and arrested Morrison along with several of his associates. Watching the man who had owned her led away in handcuffs felt surreal to Sarah, as if she were witnessing events happening to someone else. It's really over, she whispered, hardly daring to believe that the threat that had shadowed their mountain paradise was finally being eliminated. This part is over, Bear corrected gently. But Sarah, your real life is just beginning. The trial that followed made regional headlines, exposing a network of corruption and exploitation that shocked even those familiar with the seedy underbelly of Appalachian commerce. Sarah's testimony was compelling and detailed, delivered with a strength that surprised even her as she faced down the man who had tried to destroy her dignity and freedom. Morrison's conviction on federal charges carried a 20-year sentence, effectively ending his criminal enterprise and dismantling the network of local officials who had enabled his activities. More importantly for Sarah, it represented official recognition that she had been the victim of serious crimes rather than a willing participant in immoral activities. The court formally acknowledges that Miss Coleman was trafficked illegally and held against her will, the federal judge declared during sentencing. Her courage in coming forward has not only secured justice for herself, but has protected countless other young women from similar exploitation. After the trial concluded, Sarah and Bear faced decisions about their future that went beyond simply returning to their mountain sanctuary. The publicity surrounding the case had drawn attention from social workers, educators, and activists who wanted to involve Sarah in efforts to combat trafficking and help other victims. The Women's Legal Defense Fund has offered you a position, Bear told her as they walked through Charleston's downtown area, both of them still processing the magnitude of what they had accomplished. You'd travel throughout Appalachia, speaking to young women about recognizing and avoiding predators like Morrison. Sarah considered the opportunity seriously, recognizing that her experiences uniquely qualified her to help others in similar situations. What do you think I should do? I think you should follow your heart, Bear replied. You've proven that you're strong enough to handle whatever challenges come your way, and you have wisdom that could save lives. That evening, as they prepared for their return journey to the mountains, Bear presented Sarah with a simple gold band that caught the lamplight like captured fire. I know we've been through more in 6 months than most couples experience in a lifetime, he said quietly. But Sarah, I want to spend whatever time we have left making sure you never again doubt that you're worthy of love and respect. Sarah stared at the ring through tears that blurred her vision, overwhelmed by the distance she had traveled from the broken girl sold for $2 to a woman being asked to share a life built on mutual respect and genuine affection. Are you proposing to me, Samuel Hawkins? She asked, using his formal name to mark the solemnity of the moment. I'm asking if you'll marry me, Bear replied simply. Not because you need protection or because I need a housekeeper, but because we're better people together than we are apart." Sarah's answer was wordless, conveyed through the kiss that sealed their engagement and the tears that spoke of healing wounds and hope restored. The ring slipped onto her finger as if it had been made specifically for her, completing a transformation that had begun in an alley behind a brothel and culminated in this moment of choosing love over fear. Their wedding took place 2 months later in the small mountain church where Bear had occasionally attended services, with Agent Fletcher serving as best man and Mrs. Henderson, who had turned state's evidence, against Morrison standing as Sarah's maid of honor. The ceremony was simple but meaningful, attended by the scattered mountain families who had come to respect both Bear's strength and Sarah's courage. "You look beautiful," Bear whispered as they exchanged vows in front of the small congregation, and Sarah knew he meant it completely. The woman reflected in his eyes was confident, capable, and worthy of love, someone she had never imagined she could become. After their honeymoon, in the mountain cabin that had been their first sanctuary, Sarah began her work with the Women's Legal Defense Fund, traveling throughout Appalachia to speak at schools, community centers, and churches about the realities of human trafficking. Her message was simple but powerful. Every person had inherent worth that couldn't be bought or sold, and freedom was a right worth fighting to protect. Bear often accompanied her on these speaking engagements, providing security and moral support, while Sarah shared her story with audiences who needed to hear that survival was possible, that healing was achievable, and that love could triumph over the cruelest circumstances. "The girl who was sold for $2, Sarah would tell these audiences, was told she was worthless, unlovable, and destined for a life of degradation. But that was a lie. Every person in this room has value that can't be measured in dollars or determined by other people's prejudices." The work was emotionally demanding but deeply rewarding, and Sarah discovered that helping others heal from trauma accelerated her own recovery. Each young woman who escaped a dangerous situation, each family that learned to recognize warning signs, each community that committed to protecting its vulnerable members, represented a victory against the forces that had once seemed insurmountable. 5 years after their wedding, Sarah and Bear had established a network of safe houses throughout the mountain regions, places where trafficking victims could find refuge and support while rebuilding their lives. The program had expanded beyond their wildest hopes, funded by federal grants and private donations from people who had been moved by Sarah's testimony and example. "You've saved more lives than any soldier I knew in Korea," Bear told Sarah one evening as they reviewed reports from their various programs. "And you've done it through compassion rather than violence." Sarah smiled as she looked around their expanded cabin, now equipped with offices and guest rooms for the steady stream of social workers, legal advocates, and recovering victims who passed through their mountain sanctuary. "We've saved lives," she corrected. "This was never something I could have accomplished alone." The girl who had once believed herself worthless had become a woman who helped others discover their own value. The crippled daughter sold by her father had transformed into a fierce advocate for the vulnerable and forgotten. The mountain man who had lived in isolation had found purpose in protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. Their love story had begun with a transaction conducted in an alley between predators and prey, but it had evolved into something that touched hundreds of lives and changed thousands more. Sarah Coleman Hawkins had indeed become a queen, not through royal blood or inherited titles, but through the kind of nobility that came from refusing to let cruelty win, from choosing love over hate, and from believing that every person deserved dignity regardless of their circumstances. As she fell asleep each night in the arms of the man who had first seen her worth when she couldn't see it herself, Sarah marveled at the journey that had brought her from the depths of despair to heights of happiness she had never imagined possible. The mountain had claimed her, healed her, and given her a crown worth more than gold, the knowledge that she was exactly who she was meant to be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, You won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.
Celebration, which is a huge milestone for people, particularly in the maker space. I think that we just have just such a smaller community. Oh, thank you so much, Tash. Yeah, it's been wicked. Yeah, 100% agree. I concur. I fucking love that I've met you through Joe and just everyone else. It's just been hell awesome being able to meet everyone. I think that this is just such a badass space too. I think that there's just so many different amazing creators that I just fucking love. I fucking eat it up. I love people sharing their passions and yeah, sharing that passion with everyone and showing their crafts, their artwork, whether it's fiber art, whether it's, chainmail, whether it's pottery, it doesn't matter. It could be 3D printing as well. I think, and there's also I think there's an art form when it comes to like Legos, like doing Lego design, you know? Like person that comes to mind is everyone's hero. He's hell awesome at creating his own designs. Like we're talking like big, like landscapes with like different buildings and structures and just I love that side of where people can express themselves through different mediums. But yeah, whatever the fancy is, whatever the passion or art is, I love it all. But yeah, so our side quest, the TLDR for people after that hell long story is we're gonna do 3D printing, ceramics, and yeah, if I can combine the two, fuck yeah. Which there are ways in which I will be. I'm going to be making stamps that are TPU printed, which is this flexible filament. So I'll be 3D printing some designs to sell as well for ceramic printing, for like ceramic stamping and that type of thing. Oh, good night, Kamaya.
Vessel approaching.
Oh my goodness, another raid. It is just raidception tonight. Welcome in, Crafty K3. How's your stream? I hope you had an amazing stream. Hello. Thank you for giving a shout out to Crafty K3. Let us know what you were up to tonight. We also can post some socials at the top of chat for you as well. But yeah, welcome in. Hello to you. I'm just going to double check. I believe I was following you. Oh, handcrafted note cards and cross stitch. Hell yes. I fucking love that. Yes, I am. Fuck yeah. It's a crafty raid. Oh, I love it. Oh, I love that. It's so cute. Oh, that's such a cute little. Oh my God. It's a little worm. Is that a little worm? Is that what that is?